So oligarchs generally find ways to argue that the mass of people are inferior, that their lives are not worth living, and indeed that they're closer to animals than they are to the elite. So whenever you have an oligarchical elite, they're always going to try to portray the masses as ignorant beasts, inferior, or whatever else it is. And that's what we see. This is very strong in the Anglo-American world. The U.S.-British tradition is not that of a dictator. Stalin, Hitler, this you generally don't find. It's also not so much in the notion of mob rule and demagogy of that sort, although occasionally it is. Generally what you have in terms of real power is an oligarchy. So this oligarchy is inherited from Venice, from the Venetian Republic of the Middle Ages, and it's transferred into Britain between 1500 and 1600 or so in the form of the Whig Party, the top aristocratic party, which rules Britain from the early 1600s really until about 1832 and the Reform Bill. So it's an oligarchical system. The US and the British are a polycentric oligarchy where you can't say the Bilderberger runs it, or the Trilateral, or the CFR, or Bohemian Grove, or whatever it is. All of those are power centers that jostle each other and coexist. But what they amount to is an oligarchy. If you have a tyrant, you can convince the tyrant to change policy. It can be done. But to change an oligarchy, as Plato points out, is harder because you've got to convince so many different ones, and as soon as you convince some of them, you've deconvinced others because those are the enemies and they hate the ones that you've convinced. So that's the problem that we face in the Anglo-American world. The Club of Rome is a group of old fascists, for want of a better word. Aurelio Peccei was the most prominent guy. He had been a fascist for Mussolini in the Balkans during World War II, done all manner of crimes there. And then we have his associate, Alexander King, who admitted that embarrassing thing, that the purpose of this was to express the genocide of the Third World. In other words, that it was designed to make sure that there would be no Third World development, that therefore the black and brown people of the world would not become numerous. So the Club of Rome is already the beginning of a genocidal mentality in which Holdren and Cass Sunstein and other people in the Obama regime participate. Naturally, as this becomes more extreme, as the breakdown crisis gets worse, and it is getting worse, as the depression deepens, you get into the definitions of useless eaters, lives not worthy of being lived, non-productive culls, they're called sometimes, surplus population, as Scrooge said, following Bentham and Malthus. And how many are there of such people? As the depression gets worse, it gets to be more and more of the population that are useless eaters and non-productive culls. So the problem that we face is the ideology has deteriorated. The global warming ideology is, at least up to now, the most extreme form, because it says that carbon dioxide is a pollutant and that carbon is bad when we ourselves are a carbon-based form of life. So it seems to say that the inevitable results of humanity is pollution, that people pollute, or indeed that people are pollution. It gets back to Ehrlich and Holdren and their idea that humanity is a cancer on the face of the earth. So the ultimate logic of all this is extermination, genocide, the concentration camp, depopulation, and a horror that goes beyond anything seen in the 20th century. That's where Obama is essentially leading. When Holdren is confronted with his published works, the body of work on which his scientific credentials rest, he wants to run away from them and say that he's no longer the environmental extremist that he once was, that his genocidal fury has mellowed with age. But I wouldn't believe that for a minute. It's just that he's become a little bit more sophisticated politically, and he's seen how damaging it is when people throw that stuff at you. It's, of course, a monstrosity that he was allowed to get through that confirmation process in the first place. In terms of genocide, genocide entered the U.S. policy realm in an overt way with this National Security Memorandum 200 by Kissinger in the 1974-75 period, which said that if you have population growth in third world countries, they will compete for the limited natural resources that the U.S. intends to monopolize. I attended the food conference, the World Food Conference of the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome in December of 1974, which was attended by Kissinger. And I put out some leaflets at this FAO conference in Rome in late 1974. And in response to that, the UN bureaucracy kicked me out of the conference, not for disrupting anything, but simply by pointing out the obvious implications of what was going on. At that same conference, the Soviet delegate made a useful contribution. He said that if you just took the existing off-the-shelf technology and made that available to everybody, you would have no problem with 35 billion people on the earth. The demographic potential is still very, very large, lots and lots of wide open spaces, but they kicked me out. So the Kissinger line was, stop population growth in third world countries, because otherwise they'll compete for natural resources. I guess he's looking into what happens today with Chinese oil consumption and the Chinese in Africa offering their own bids for mining and other products. The other thing to stress is under Carter, and in particular under Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, you had Global 2000 and Global Futures. And that is the real watershed of making genocide, population reduction, euthanasia, population control into the dominant ideology of the U.S. government, the foreign policy establishment, and the State Department. Global 2000 and Global Futures enacted under Muskie are really the turning point, after which U.S. policy in the developing sector is no longer development, but it's rather population control, population reduction with strong genocidal overtones. Holdren writes books about nuclear target selection, nuclear war. He's a strangelove. He's a strangelove under green left cover. However, he recognizes what strangeloves often forget. You can kill more people with economic means than you can with military means. Robert McNamara did his best to escalate Vietnam. Robert McNamara killed more people at the World Bank than he ever did at the Pentagon. The general estimate is, 40,000 people a day, meaning 15, 20 million a year minimum, die as a result of the IMF conditionalities. They die of starvation, malnutrition, and diseases like diarrhea that can be cured for a few pennies. So that's the cost of the IMF-based system is already in the neighborhood of 20 million dead per year. And again, 40,000 per day. And that's an old figure. Now that we have the Depression, it's probably more like 50,000 a day or more, because the effect of the Depression is obviously to increase that figure. This is a book called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. The authors, Paul R. Ehrlich of Stanford University. This is the charlatan with the population bomb. Ann H. Ehrlich, who is an environmental fanatic in her own right. And John P. Holdren of the University of California, Berkeley, today White House Science Czar for Obama. Published by the W.H. Freeman and Company Publishing House in San Francisco. And the edition I have here is 1977, so we're in the Jimmy Carter era. First edition, 1970, second edition, 1972. And as you can see, this is a hefty tome. This is the best part of 1,000 pages, more than 1,000 pages. If you count the index, we get up to 1,500 pages of raving, insane Malthusian drivel. And he tells you he's a Malthusian, a neo-Malthusian. He loves Darwin. He loves the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. And in some ways, he wants to bring that into human society. Now, the heart of the book, I think, for political purposes, has to do with the measures that Holdren proposes to implement as a means of slowing, stopping, and reversing population growth. The heart of the book, I think, starts on page 783. Population control, direct measures. You've got to convince people of the necessity of reducing population. For example, one thing he quotes approvingly, a case in point was the sudden imposition in 1976 of compulsory sterilization in some states in India and for government employees in Delhi, following 2 decades of discouraging results from voluntary family planning. So let's make it involuntary, compulsory, obligatory, and we're going to come in with compulsory sterilization. Let's jump ahead to the involuntary controls. In the 1960s, it was proposed to vasectomize all fathers of 3 or more children in India. India entertained the policy of compulsory sterilization, and if they had really done it, then they would have been better off, as Holdren says. A program of sterilizing women after their 2nd or 3rd child, despite the fact that this is harder to do than a vasectomy, might be easier to implement than sterilizing men. Other than that, Holdren is interested, and again on page 787, the development of a long-term sterilizing capsule that could be implanted under the skin and removed when pregnancy is desired. Well, this is Norplant, and that's been implanted in victim populations in U.S. inner cities now for a couple of decades. One of the problems is, how do you get it out? The government puts it in, but who's going to help you to take it out? That's a little bit harder. Another proposal that Holdren is interested in, he quotes the economist Kevin Boulding, British, I'm pretty sure. Boulding proposed to issue to each woman at maturity a marketable license that would entitle her to have a fixed number of children. And of course, again, if Goldman Sachs gets into the market, then that could be priced out of reach of poor people. He quotes social scientists who have looked into the effects of a marketable license for birth. A very interesting chart on page 788. Baby licenses. We're told that you can have a monthly subsidy if you have no more than 2 children. You can have a monthly tax on people with more than 2 children to discourage that. A one-time lump sum tax on excess babies over 2. So if you're over 2 children, that's excess. And quotas for families. So again, the basic idea is some measures designed to persuade, and then the hardcore, hardline measures, compulsory sterilization, compulsory abortion, and it's also a good idea to take children away from mothers if they're teenagers, unmarried, and otherwise not suitable. Now, he wants to impose this not just domestically in the U.S., but even more. He wants to have family planning measures. Here on page 789, he wants to have family planning measures in the less developed countries. High priority should be given to stimulating attitude changes and counteracting the effects of pro-natalist traditions. You may remember President de Gaulle of France talked about 100 million Frenchmen as a national goal. Obviously, for Holdren, this is impossible. What are the problems with this? Well, one problem is human rights, page 793. Some people have this idea that there's a fundamental human right for each person responsibly to determine the size of his or her own family. Holdren doesn't like that one. Could this be done in the U.S.? Well, we have the Constitution. Holdren laments, and now we're on page 837. To date, there has been no serious attempt in Western countries, Europe, U.S., Japan, to use laws to control excessive population growth, although there exists ample authority under which population growth could be regulated.